Nicole Kidman breaks her silence. The truth behind the divorce with Keith Urban. A one-year marriage in ruins. Nicole Kidman crushed by the truth. For years, the world saw Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban as one of Australia's golden couples, shining on the red carpet, whispering sweet nothings in front of cameras, and posting affectionate messages that made millions believe in love again. But behind the velvet curtains and diamond smiles, there was something else, something darker. And now, Nicole has finally spoken. In a dimly lit interview room tucked away in a quiet corner of Sydney, Nicole sat down with trembling hands and a soul heavy with truths long buried. She wasn't the luminous star who had once graced the stages of Hollywood and Cannes. She was something far more raw, more human. "I kept quiet for so long," she whispered, almost to herself. "Because I wanted to protect the image, and him. But I forgot to protect myself." Nicole Kidman, the Oscar-winning actress who once portrayed the depths of pain in others so convincingly on screen, had been enduring her own private torment for over a year. One inflicted not by a faceless stranger, but by the man she had vowed to love. Keith Urban, the charming country music star, the man whose songs once made her weep with joy, was no longer the man she thought she married. It began subtly, too subtly to recognize as something sinister. The emotional distance, the constant absences, the whispered phone calls behind closed doors. But over time, things escalated. Nicole recounts moments of being gaslighted, humiliated behind closed doors, and slowly erased in her own home. "It wasn't about bruises," she said, her voice catching. "It was about breaking me in places no camera could see." The decision to marry Keith came at a time when Nicole craved stability. After the emotionally complex years with Tom Cruise and a long period of rebuilding, she thought Keith was her safe haven. They shared Australian roots, a love for artistry, and what she believed was mutual respect. But love, as Nicole now confesses, can be blinding. "He knew how to say all the right things, but behind the poetry was control, not care." One night stands out in her memory like a shard of glass. She had returned from a shoot in New York, excited to surprise Keith for their first wedding anniversary. Instead, she walked into their home in Nashville and found silence. No roses, no music. Just Keith sitting alone with a look that drained the warmth from the room. "He looked at me like I was an interruption to his life, not a part of it." Nicole tried to salvage what she could. Therapy sessions, long, vulnerable letters, private getaways that ended in bitter silence. But she slowly realized that she was fading. Friends noticed. Her children asked quiet questions. Her mother visited more often, watching with knowing eyes. And through it all, Nicole smiled for the cameras, walked carpets in couture, and nodded politely when reporters called them perfect. But what finally broke her wasn't a fight. It wasn't infidelity. It was a simple comment, said over breakfast, with the kind of icy detachment that made her skin crawl. Keith had looked at her and said, "Maybe you were just better as a character, not a wife." The weight of that sentence hit her like a freight train. It wasn't just a jab. It was a summation of all the quiet violence she had endured. That morning, Nicole packed a small bag, kissed her children on the forehead, and walked out. There was no dramatic scene, no screaming match, just the quiet sound of a woman reclaiming her breath. In the months that followed, Nicole retreated from the public eye. Rumors swirled, tabloids speculated, but she remained silent, until now. And as she sits, recalling the year that almost destroyed her, there is no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion, and a kind of fragile strength that can only be born from surviving what others never saw. She speaks carefully, choosing each word like a note in a melody that has long been trapped inside her. I don't hate him, she says, but I can't pretend anymore. This story, it's mine now. As Nicole Kidman finally breaks the silence, the world watches with bated breath. Not for gossip, not for scandal, but for the raw truth of a woman who dared to leave. Not for another man or for attention, but for herself. For the self she had long abandoned beneath layers of expectation, of performance, of carefully curated love. What really happened inside the walls of their marriage? What did Keith Urban truly say and do when the cameras turned away? And what other truths has Nicole yet to unveil? One thing is clear. This is not the end of her story. It's only the first chapter of a voice that will no longer be silenced. Nicole didn't sleep the night she left. She sat in the back of a rented car, barefoot, her heels tucked under the passenger seat, staring out the window as the lights of Nashville blurred into ghostly ribbons. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, didn't say a word. He seemed to understand the silence she needed. At one point, she reached for her phone to message Keith, but her fingers froze above the screen. What could she possibly say that hadn't already been said 1,000 times in her head? Her destination wasn't a hotel. It was a small cabin in Leiper's Fork, an old artist's retreat she'd once visited during the filming of Big Little Lies. The owner, a friend, handed her the key without questions, only a brief hug that lingered longer than usual. The cabin was rustic, surrounded by eucalyptus and silence, with a creaky wooden floor and a fireplace that smoked a little too much. It became her hideaway, her cocoon. Inside, Nicole lived like someone trying to remember how to breathe. She started her mornings barefoot in the dew-drenched grass, tea in hand, wrapped in an old gray cardigan that belonged to her mother. She wrote in longhand, not a script, not a role, just fragments. Sentences that began with, I remember, or I used to believe. She cooked simple meals, scrambled eggs, toast, tomato soup. She burnt the first few tries. She laughed, alone, for the first time in months. There was a mirror in the cabin, tall, antique, cracked slightly in the corner, and Nicole, stripped of designer gowns, now wore flannel and faded jeans. Her face, once meticulously maintained for public adoration, was now raw, unfiltered, and beautiful in its surrender. Her eyes, blue and vast, no longer darted for approval. They settled, softly, into who she had become. One afternoon, she unpacked a box she hadn't opened in years. Letters, photos, a scarf from Moulin Rouge, a copy of To the Lighthouse, dog-eared and rain-stained, and in the bottom, a small note in Keith's handwriting. To my muse, you shine even in the dark. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to cry, burn it, or tuck it back where it came from. The cabin had a piano, slightly out of tune, keys yellowing. Nicole hadn't touched a piano since she was a girl. But now, in the quiet dusk, she sat before it and let her fingers find forgotten melodies. Not perfect, not rehearsed, just honest. Her playing became a ritual. As the sun dipped, she played softly, sometimes Chopin, sometimes just improvised notes that sounded like memory. Every evening, she lit a candle. A simple ritual, almost childlike but deeply personal. It wasn't for prayer or show. It was a quiet defiance. I'm still here, the flame seemed to whisper. I survived. Occasionally, her daughters visited, Sunday afternoons with board games and leftover pasta. They never asked too many questions. They simply curled beside her, giggled, painted each other's nails, and spoke in the kind of coded affection only mothers and daughters understand. Nicole found herself watching them more than speaking, memorizing their voices, the way they threw their heads back when they laughed. It reminded her why she'd left. why she had to. And then there were the nights, long, stretching, and sometimes cruel. Memories didn't always respect boundaries. Some came uninvited. Keith's voice through a closed door, the sound of a champagne cork on the night of their wedding, the way he once called her angel, and later, with venom, impossible. Nicole kept a small notebook by her bed. In it, she wrote dreams, nightmares, and sometimes just lists. Remember your strength. You are not the role they gave you. The silence was never your fault. One rainy night, she went into town for groceries. A woman at the register stared for a second too long. Nicole braced for recognition, for the whisper of, "Oh my God, is that Nicole Kidman?" But the woman simply smiled. "You look tired, love. Everything all right?" Nicole paused, and then, without thinking, she said, "Getting better." It wasn't a performance. It was the truth. Slowly, the cabin became a part of her. The creaks in the wood spoke to her. The chipped teacups felt like old friends. The solitude wasn't frightening anymore. It was sacred. She began journaling in the margins of her old scripts, rereading old reviews, not the glowing ones, but the brutal ones, seeing how she survived every one of them, every disappointment, every heartbreak, every public breakdown she had to mask with lipstick and lace. She started watching her old films again, not to critique, but to rediscover. In each character, Satine, Virginia Woolf, Celeste, she found pieces of herself she had forgotten: grief, passion, fury, survival. She wasn't playing those women, she was them. And now, in this strange interlude of her life, they whispered back to her, reminding her she had always been more than someone's wife. One day she sat on the cabin's porch, pen in hand, and wrote a line that might one day open her memoir. "I lost myself in love, and I found myself in solitude." And still, the world waited. The press, the fans, the critics, wanting the next headline, the next scandal. But Nicole was no longer interested in feeding that hunger. She wasn't a phoenix rising from the ashes, too dramatic, too final. She was something slower, quieter, a woman returning to herself one breath at a time. And though the world didn't yet know the full story behind the divorce, behind the long nights, the cruel words, the stifling quiet, Nicole did. She carried it not like a burden, but like a shadow that had finally stepped out of her body and into the light. But what happens when a woman like Nicole Kidman finally tells the truth? What will the world do with it? What will Keith Urban say when the silence turns against him? That remains unwritten. Some say Nicole Kidman's silence was a calculated move. Others whisper it was fear. But those who have known her, truly known her, speak of a woman who holds pain like a locket, tightly shut, worn close to the skin, where the clasp is nearly invisible. And now, just as that locket begins to creak open, we're left with pieces. Not a whole story, but scattered moments that tug at something deep, something we almost recognize in ourselves. In the weeks that followed her retreat to the cabin, Nicole began receiving letters. Not emails, not texts. Handwritten notes, no return addresses, just crisp envelopes slipped through the wooden mailbox at the gate, always on Mondays. One read, "You were never the problem." Another, "He still talks about you like a ghost." She never mentioned them to anyone, not even to her sister when she called, not even to the trusted friend who delivered groceries and left rosemary by the window. Nicole simply tucked them away in an old shoebox beneath the bed, rereading them on nights when the wind howled and her chest ached from unnamed longings. But there were other signs, too. A figure spotted outside the gate late at night, never seen clearly, only the sound of footsteps fading. A bouquet of peonies left without a note. And once, just once, the scent of Keith's cologne lingering on her front porch. So faint, she thought she might have imagined it. But the feeling it left behind, that was real. The local mechanic, Mick, swore he'd seen Keith's truck near the trails behind the property one evening. He didn't say anything at the time, didn't want to stir things. "Could have been someone else," he mumbled when Nicole asked him weeks later, eyes darting. But his tone betrayed a different truth. Still, Nicole said nothing. Not to him, not to the others in town who began to notice the woman with the famous face moving like a ghost through the aisles of the grocer's. Her eyes hidden behind sunglasses even on cloudy days. They said she was kind, quiet, a bit lost. No one dared ask her about Keith. What kept her up at night wasn't the past, not exactly. It was the moments that didn't fit. The way Keith used to grip her hand during interviews, not as affection, but as subtle warning. The time he changed the lyrics of a song mid-performance and looked straight at her. The unexplained bruises on her self-worth. But he never hit her. Not once. It was never that simple. And yet, in the stillness of the cabin, memories blurred. Had he loved her, even a little? Or had she only played the part of the beloved, carefully cast in his life, the way she'd been cast so many times before? These questions haunted her more than any fight ever could. She wrote obsessively now, in notebooks, on the backs of receipts, on napkins tucked under plates. Her handwriting changed, slanted, then frantic, then small and neat. Some mornings she would wake to find sentences she didn't remember writing. He said I was his mirror, but mirrors break when stared at too long. Was I ever real in his life? What does it mean to be free if I'm still dreaming of his voice? There was talk of a tell-all. Her agent called twice with offers. Publishers are lining up, he said. All they want is the truth, or even just your version of it. But Nicole wasn't sure there was a version she could stand behind. Truth, she'd come to realize, was slippery. What she remembered in the morning felt false by nightfall. What felt like cruelty one day resembled longing the next. One afternoon, while walking the edge of the woods, she found an old photograph stuck between two stones by the creek. Weather-worn, edges curling. It was a picture of her and Keith, one that had never been made public. She was in a white dress, barefoot, laughing, her arms thrown around him. He looked at the camera, unsure, or maybe calculating. She couldn't remember who took it. She couldn't remember the moment at all. How had it ended up here? Why now? When she brought it back to the cabin, she placed it on the mantel. Not out of sentiment, but out of curiosity. The mystery of it gnawed at her more than the memory. There were pieces of her life she no longer recognized. Was someone trying to remind her? Or was someone warning her not to forget? As the days passed, she found more oddities. A cassette tape in the mailbox, labeled for her, with a song she didn't recognize but swore she'd heard before. A script she never auditioned for, printed and left under her windshield wiper, with the lead character's name, Nora Kinsley. Too close, too uncanny. And yet, Nicole didn't panic. She didn't run. She welcomed the strangeness like an old friend. Because beneath it all, beneath the whispers, the letters, the flickering glances of townsfolk, there was something else building, a reckoning, or perhaps a revelation. Keith had always underestimated her silence, thought it meant surrender. But what he didn't understand, what he never truly grasped, was that Nicole's silence wasn't empty. It was gathering, growing, turning into something sharp, something that might one day speak in ways he couldn't control. Maybe she would tell the world everything, or maybe she wouldn't say another word. That was the power she now held, And until she decided, all anyone could do was wait, watching the woman behind the lace curtains, scribbling truths in ink that may never dry. What really happened between them? What line did Keith cross in the dark, thinking no one would see? Why is Nicole still receiving anonymous notes? And why do they seem to come from someone who knows her too well? We don't know. Not yet. But Nicole does. And one day, perhaps in a book, a whisper, or a performance so haunting we mistake it for fiction, she might show us. Or she might not. The candle still burns on her windowsill each night. A quiet signal. A question unanswered. The seasons shifted. Summer's heat gave way to the cooler hush of autumn. Leaves curled brown at the edges and drifted down around the cabin like forgotten pages. Nicole walked beneath them, hair loose, hands buried in the pockets of an old trench coat. The kind she used to wear to rehearsals in London when she still believed in the safety of repetition. Lines, takes, call sheets, applause. Life now felt less scripted, more jagged. There were no takes, no marks to hit, just days stretching into each other, carrying the weight of things said and unsaid. One evening, as the light dimmed and a soft drizzle painted the windows, Nicole found herself sitting before the fireplace again. The photograph was still there on the mantel, slightly warped now from the heat. She studied it, not the obvious, but the edges. The way her hand gripped Keith's wrist, not his fingers. The stiffness in his smile. The slight turn of her head, as if she were already looking away. She reached for the photo once, hesitated, then left it where it was. The letters had stopped 2 weeks earlier. The silence that followed was louder than she expected. She missed them. Missed the mystery, the sensation that someone was watching, but not out of malice, out of remembrance. She found herself waking up to check the mailbox anyway, pretending it was just to stretch her legs. Some days she'd linger at the gate, as though something, someone, might emerge from the trees. And yet nothing did. A package arrived instead. Brown paper, no return address, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single item, a vintage locket, worn gold with a pressed violet inside. No note, just the locket. She didn't open it for days. When she finally did, there was a scrap of paper hidden behind the flower with 4 words written in faded ink. She never said no. Nicole stared at the words, cold, creeping through her spine. She couldn't tell if it was a threat, an accusation, or a lament. The ambiguity of it was almost worse than any confession. She closed the locket and put it in the drawer, far from reach, but never quite out of mind. Later that night, she sat at the piano again. The keys were colder now, slightly out of tune. She didn't play a song, just notes, scattered, echoing, hesitant. It sounded like questions. It always did. A dog barked in the distance. Wind rustled through the trees. And then, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. Nicole froze. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. She waited, holding her breath, listening. Nothing followed. Just silence, dense and knowing. The next morning, a smudge appeared on the outside of her kitchen window. Fingerprints, as though someone had leaned in, looked in. She didn't call the police, she didn't tell anyone. Instead, she took a camera and set it by the sill, quietly clicking a single photo of the smudge. She printed it, studied it, not for evidence, but for meaning. But like so much else, it revealed nothing. There was a dinner party that month, hosted by an old friend who had no idea what Nicole was hiding from. She arrived late, hair tied back, lips bare. The room hushed slightly when she entered, not out of fame, but out of the quiet awe she now carried. People offered her wine, compliments, half-baked apologies for not being in touch. A writer approached her at one point, someone she'd met only once, years ago, at an award ceremony in Cannes. He looked at her as if seeing her through a fog. "You've changed," he said, "but not in the way people usually mean." Nicole tilted her head. "How do you mean, then?" He shrugged, eyes flickering. "You're quieter, but heavier, like you're filled with something that's still burning." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. By the time she returned to the cabin, the wind had picked up. The trees hissed. The world around her was whispering again. That night, she dreamed of Keith, not as he was, but as a boy, alone in a field, shouting something she couldn't hear. When she woke, she realized her hands were clenched into fists. Her palms were red with crescent moons from her nails. More days passed. Letters still didn't come. But the feeling remained that she was being watched not out of hate, but regret. That someone, somewhere, was waiting for her to say something, to speak the final word, to close the book. But she never did. Instead, she opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "What if some endings aren't meant to be written? What if the story keeps echoing long after the characters leave the stage?" She closed the cover, stood, and opened the window. The air was sharp, smelling of smoke and earth. Somewhere far off, an owl called. The photograph on the mantel had fallen. Not to the floor, but sideways, its frame tilted, its image half hidden in shadow. Nicole left it there. She stepped outside, into the half-dark, into the hush between words, into the pause that follows a confession never spoken aloud. She didn't look back at the cabin. She didn't need to. And if, at that moment, someone was watching from beyond the trees, from the hush of the woods, they saw not a woman escaping, not a star fading, but a figure slipping into something undefined, untethered. Was she walking away from the past, or towards something she hadn't yet dared name? Was Keith Urban still out there, haunted by what he did, or what he failed to do? Did the truth matter anymore? Or was it now only a series of flickers in the dark, glimpsed but never grasped? The wind answered nothing. The woods kept their silence. And the story remained unfinished.